you all for coming. It's a thrill to be here. And I know some of you, like me, snuck out a little bit and went to the march. And all I can say about that is it proves that you can't really rain on this parade. It's been a fabulous and wonderful set of optimistic views of what's going on in the world. And what I want to do is share a little bit with you about where I work. I've gone all over the world talking about the trouble that the ocean is in. We've heard about that. But then I come home to this. And here in Monterey Bay, the question in my mind was, if the world is in such trouble, how do I live and work in a place that is so gorgeous and wonderful as this? Was it always this way? Was there always this incredible intersection between people and the bay? And the answer is no, it was not always this way. In fact, Monterey Bay was a place that was stunningly gorgeous hundreds of years ago. It was almost ruined, but it got better. This is the story about it getting better and how that happened. Basically, the trouble was the business model of the ocean. We started taking the otters out of Monterey Bay, which reduced the kelp forest. Then we took the whales, then we took the seals, then we took the abalone, then we took the seabirds. The business model was find something that you could take with profit, take it till it was gone, repeat. And that was a problem even with Monterey's iconic fishery, the sardines. And that fishery started about 1907. It got much bigger. But this one was an industry with a difference because it came along not just with the fishery, but with industrial pollution of the cannery itself. Rolf Berlin was a professor at Hopkins where I work, and he wrote that the fumes from the scum floating on the waters of the bay were so bad they turned lead-based paints black. These canneries were processing 1 million pounds of sardines a day. 10% of that was dropping into the water, 100,000 pounds of sardine guts and scales and heads falling into the water. So the bay was polluted, the air was polluted with the ovens, and all the wildlife was gone. So this was the nadir of Monterey Bay. But that was the point where a change occurred. People started thinking differently about their rights with respect to how the ocean worked. And I want to highlight one amazing woman, B Platt. This is her basically at a graduate class in Woods Hole. She got a bachelor's degree at the University of Vermont in 1879, but you couldn't get a bachelor's degree if you were a woman. You had to be a bachelor's equivalent. She got a PhD in zoology in the 1890s, but you couldn't get a PhD in the United States in zoology if you were a woman. You had to go to Europe, so hers was from Germany. She came back to the United States, and she really settled in Pacific Grove and became a civic activist. And she fought for the ability of people to live and work within the context of the ocean environment of Monterey Bay. And her most famous exploit is this one in the center, her on the ladder. Because a house along the beach in Monterey Bay had put up a fence that kept people off the beach. That was illegal. Everybody has access to the beach. She broke the fence. And as she broke the lock, they put it back. She broke the lock again, they put it back. And so what she did essentially then was to go with a crowbar and a ladder and rip the fence down and lay it on the beach. She also took a photographer because Julia was very hip to getting the word out, and she invented tweeting. Because everything she did around, she put up these little signs, and I want to show you the sign she put up on this fence that she took down. It says, "Opened by Julia B. Platt, this entrance to the beast must be left open at all hours and the public might reasonably wish to pass through. I act in the matter because the council and police department of Pacific Grove are men and possibly somewhat timid." The fence stayed down, access was open from then on. But she also needed to then work on the canneries and the problems that they were that they were producing. And she knew that the canneries' economic power prevented any change. In fact, she sued the canneries over and over, and nothing would happen. She needed political power. And so this was now the 1930s. The city council said, Julia, if you want to run the town, you have to be mayor. So she ran for mayor. Her slogan was, it will take a good man to beat me. None did. She became mayor. She convinced the California state legislature to give her town control over the subtidal land, something it had never done before and has never done since. She convinced the Pacific Grove City Council to pass an ordinance setting up the Pacific Grove Marine Gardens because she was a gardener. And she thought, why not garden the oceans from where the tiny larvae may swim or be carried by currents to all points along the shore and become attached, grow up, and replace those taken for food or curio. Now, this is not something from the scientific paper. This is something from the minutes of the city council meeting of Pacific Grove in 1931. So Julia was really amazingly ahead of her time. Well, turns out that the canneries did not last forever. They collapsed because the sardines collapsed. And it took a long time, almost 30 years, but Julia's reserve and all her marine gardens worked. Because decades later, when the sea otter populations were beginning to recover, they came back into Monterey Bay. They came back in, they went right to the places that Julia had protected because that's where the most food was, the most abalone. And the kelp forest regrew, bringing back with it a huge number of species that were living in those kelp forests and lived there. Now, it wasn't just Julia and her work that brought back Monterey Bay. It was that started it. We got otters back, we got kelp forests back, many species. But along the same time, this was 1963 when the otters came back, to 1974, we got the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Migratory Bird Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act. All of these things allowed the ecosystem in Monterey Bay to come back bit by bit by bit. Now, usually, scientists spend all of our time studying how ecosystems disassemble. But what had happened in Monterey Bay as a consequence of this is that the ecosystem reassembled. Places were protected, the environment was protected, and the ecosystem could return. Well, this is a point in a lot of stories where people start eating the ecosystem again because it's coming back. Well, what happened in Monterey to stop that from happening and starting the entire cycle again? This happened, the Monterey Bay Aquarium. This is a picture of Julie Packard from about 1979 or 1980 or so. She's got a model of the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and behind her is the derelict Hovden Cannery, the largest sardine cannery on the west coast of the United States that was derelict because the sardines disappeared. Well, her idea, along with her sister Susan Burnett and a number of other people that were marine biologists and loved what they saw in the kelp forest. They wanted to bring that to other people. And so they brought that to this derelict cannery that they thought might open and 300,000 people or so would come and see it or something. It turns out that on their opening year, over 1 million people came to see the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and it's gone up and up and up ever since. And what that turned out to do is to change the business model. No longer was it exploit and repeat. The business model here was that the ecological health of the bay was intrinsic to the economy, and that health was what allowed the economy to thrive and to grow. It also meant that ecological diversity, which is great, was matched by human economic diversity. There was tourism again. There was agriculture still. There was fishing still. There was businesses still. There was a military base still. And so that multiplicity of human economic diversity allowed people to essentially use different parts of the bay. And it meant that no one was going to be allowed to ruin that bay by themselves anymore. So bringing the oceans back to life as they did was a really series of events that had a lot of interlocking parts, but it were sparked by really intense passion, incredible people doing amazing things. We talk about, if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. I like to submit, if the oceans ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And that in this particular case, although Monterey is not perfect, Monterey Bay is not perfect, there are still problems there. But those problems are now problems that people are used to grappling with in a community-wide setting. So at this point, what we have in Monterey is this history of a couple of heroes working not in concert with one another, because this happened over decades, but working passionately to solve problems that actually they thought were too big for them to solve. Julia, for example, knew she couldn't fight the canneries, but something had to be done, so she did what she could do. What that means to us right now is that we're facing problems in the ocean that are too big for any of us individually to solve. But there are things that we can do, and like Julia and like Julie, doing them is what we're doing. Doing them is what this conference is about, and that's why I'm so glad to be here this evening. Thanks very much.